Hello, it's Richard Pears from FinextraTV, and delighted today to be joined by Corey Glickman. Hi, Corey. How are you?
I'm doing very well, Richard. How about yourself?
All good. Thanks for joining us today. Corey is a partner at Infosys, and he's the global head of sustainability and design consulting at Infosys. And particularly interesting, you were named amongst the top influential designers of the decade. But leading things like sustainability, smart spaces, strategic design consulting. And I think that's why I'm really excited about today, is that you've got this pretty holistic view, and so many of us have to sort of focus in on quite narrow areas. So given that sustainability is such a broad area, it touches everything by its very nature, and the circular economy, policy, science, zero carbon, nature positive, all of these things, as a global consulting organization, a lot of this comes under your purview. So I really wanted to ask you, you know, it's what gets you up, and how do you focus, and what energizes you? How do you know what you're going to do with all of that in your remit, Corey?
Well, you're assuming I know what I'm going to be doing when I get up in the morning. But actually, it's a great opportunity. It was a position that came to me just about a year ago within an organization that has a great track record. So Infosys has, we're now in our second year of being carbon neutral. So it's not enough just to say you've done it once. We're now 2 years in a row, and we've actually improved a lot on our statistics. So we can talk a bit more about that in a little bit. But the organization has always had a very strong mandate and history. Our own journey to carbon neutrality has been close to 13 years. And it is a part of our DNA as an organization, and it reports directly through our COO and our CFO, and ultimately our CEO and board. I was very lucky to become part of a team that originally and still is internally focused. It's our Green Initiatives team, and they're the ones that make sure that we're compliant. They come up with all the incredibly active CSR programs as part of our mandate as full ESG. And I was asked to extend what we do natively as a company into our clients, which shouldn't be a surprise. I think most organizations that are a technology consultant as in a basis have a very similar agenda at this point. I'm glad to say for Infosys, it's not just about profit and money, though we certainly want to be profitable as we do this in order to sustain our movements across here. But for us, it's about doing tech for good, taking our skills and capabilities through our clients. And right now, almost every client that we have has an ESG agenda, and they're looking either where to start or how to continue down their path, because they're all different levels of maturity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right to say that having done it yourself, being 2 years, net zero meant you started obviously some time ago. So tell us more about how you got to that position, and how you then extract from the lessons learned to advise your clients.
No, certainly. So I think starting where we started our journey, it really was when the company was the foundation of the company. So if for those of you who may not know who Infosys is, it is one of the largest technology consulting firms on the planet. It was founded in India back in the early 70s. And in India, back then, the idea of a tech city didn't even exist. Matter of fact, Infosys can take credit for turning Bangalore from a village to the city that it is now. And we are currently in 125 countries around the world. We're 250,000 individuals. We have 50 million square feet of buildings, which we would claim are all smart. And we would also have a metric that 25 million square feet of that, or 50%, are LEED certain platinum certified. So for us, there's always been this wealth of resources, of human capital, of entrepreneurship, of technical capabilities, but there's also this dearth of resources when you start in India, where power wasn't consistent, still isn't consistent in many cases. Water is a rare commodity, and I believe that companies rise to solve the largest problems. So we realized, or the founders realized, that in order to have the kind of company that it wanted to be, and also to start with infrastructure for the economy there, we're very careful about our resources. And therefore, looking at that and understanding that has always been part of our DNA. So if we spin forward to about 2008, we actually approached the UN and we said, this is the company that we are. We believe we can do a lot of good with technology. We work with many of the largest companies in the world that also can have an impact. What would it take to be, the term ESG didn't even exist yet, but we talked about the environment. We talked about the social change we could have across there. We talked about the complexities of working in many kinds of industries underneath many kinds of economies and regions, which translated to ESG. So for 3 years, we worked with the UN, and we came out with a set of metrics that we would start to build our company to that next level across there. And starting in 2011, we made a commitment that we would start with carbon neutrality and how to take 10% of carbon out year over year of all of our operations, of our products and services. And last year was actually our 10th year, and we were able to hit that commitment. And of course, along the way, there were many other areas which we expanded on, whether it was diversity, whether it was around inclusivity. We started several large foundations to drive local economies across here. So for us, this is an ongoing journey. One thing that I would say was very interesting that came out of the whole COVID situation, as I think many companies looked at how this caused work from home scenarios, because we said we have a lot of buildings. So suddenly nobody can enter these buildings. And there was certainly a, quote, positive impact, I think, globally to most companies that they could say, we're not using as much carbon, we're not traveling as much, we're not using our facilities in ways. However, we took the mandate because we are technologists, not just from a software point of view, but we build a lot of mechanical things like robots, autonomous vehicles, IoT sensors, and other areas. I myself belong to a group of about 20,000 mechanical, chemical, and electrical engineers across here. And we said, okay, we've already looked at things like how do we reduce our carbon? How do we get renewable energy efficiency, right? How do we get better power purchase agreements? Let's create solar fields, which we have done. Let's figure out how to do carbon offset programs that are not based off of carbon trading or purchasing, but actually off building programs that have impacted communities. And with last year, which was really, really interesting, as we just looked at our statistics here, we were very good at scope 1 and scope 2. This year, for scope 3, we actually reduced our scope 3 by 46% emissions. Wow. It's really phenomenal if you think about where most companies are. So we're 30 years ahead of most companies with the Paris Agreement about just getting your own house in order. And now we're almost at 50% of our scope 3s. And part of that was recognizing that people weren't coming back to the office. We were traveling different, and we were using these kinds of technologies to go forward, but we needed quantitative measurements. So we actually have installed technologies and ways of collecting data that is based off of tracking revenue and based off of the interactions we're having with their companies. And we've been able to correlate those to actually reduction in carbon components. And it has been recognized by the international boards as a way of quantitatively tracking scope 3. So that was quite a big achievement for us also.
That's a phenomenal achievement. And I think it's, that was one of the things I sort of opened with, but you're starting to kind of make it clear, which is that because you're working in the built environment, you're working with smart cities, you're doing IoT sensors, you're building, robotics, etc. As you said, you're looking at, you have a complex supply chain. It's not just a software company.
Right.
And you can see the circular economy and the sort of real material impact. So when you can you expand on that a little bit further, because I think that's the thing that people really struggle with. So it's worth repeating almost, which is as you look down, on obviously greenhouse gases, scope 1, 2, 3, but even as you look across an extended value chain, how do people get a grip of this to start to know their impact, and then obviously what they have to do to reduce their impact?
Sure. I think the way to look at it is in 2 dimensions. It's perhaps because in our case, and what we do as a product by working with companies to help solutions. So we have our own supply chain, and how do we deal with our buildings and our services across there. And admittedly, as a technology firm that does a lot of coding, there may not be that rigorous as, say, a manufacturing company. But because we also do quite a bit of construction of robotics, and we do import materials from around the globe, and we work everywhere, we do have some complex supply chains, that take across there. But we also have the advantage that we do work for over 1,000 clients around the globe, and as you can imagine, there are all different kinds of supply chains that we come across. And having seen what those supply chains are and having traditionally serviced those, we really started to say, what is a modern supply chain? How does circularity really work? Where can we take out the waste? How to understand linear, versus circularity. So one of the key steps that we took was to join the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which we think is one of the leading think tanks on here, about a year and a half ago. And that certainly helped us start to understand continuous flow, the economics behind it, which were the biggest industries that needed the most help, because they also tend to teach you the most lessons across there. So we started to understand concepts such as inner loops, right, and both biological and technological wastage, and how do we take that out? How do you take reuse? How to look at anything from biomass systems, into reuse. If we couldn't take it, use everything within our system, could we help go into somebody else's system and help them achieve a circularity component? It is probably one of the most complex areas across here because margins are so tight with PLM as it is. And for the very large players, it usually starts with the question of still, how do I reduce carbon in my system? But it quickly goes to energy transmission, right? And how am I choosing my energy and my renewables? And how do I look at my suppliers, and how do I understand what's happening within my suppliers? How much control or influence can I have on my suppliers and traceability of their information so that we can be compliant? It's kind of like the famous Toyota model of having enough control, but also allowing your suppliers to create great product to put into your product across there. So it gets complex, but there's so much science out there. And the good thing is that I think one of the keys with sustainability is understanding that we all want quantitative information, and that's easier to do. Nothing's easy, I guess, but it's easier to do with environmental. I can see greenhouse gases. I can understand emissions in buildings or on machine lines. I can understand vibration. There's a lot of things I can measure quantitatively. When I look at social, about workforce diversity, or if I look at wastage, or if I look at governance and rules of ISO and other components, that's subjective and voluntary by your suppliers. And so there's a fine line there. But what's fortunate is that the economics right now are saying this is the right thing to do. I think the challenge is the information. I'll give you an example. So we're working with a very large European automotive supplier right now, and work with several of them actually. And they totally have bought into the circularity component of understanding what happens in the manufacturing plants. How do you report out on information? But they have to make a determination that they're deciding for their own levels of whether it is what they would call corporate identity and IP that says, how much information do I give out? Because theoretically, if you know everything that's in the supply chain that's going in for materials, and you can measure the wastage or the timing of something or the emissions, conceivably somebody could reverse engineer your processes, and then you lose a lot of your corporate advantage. And because there is no set rules per se or recipes as I go, it's kind of up to those individuals and those companies and to make those decisions. I think that's part of it. I think the second important point that we've learned with circularity is who's responsible for decarbonization within a supply chain. And I think this is an area that maybe is not looked at enough, but I think it is looked at in the US, it's federal, but in Europe, there's other government regulatory issues. It says, I could put decarbonization responsibility, say, with the energy provider. right? But they're quasi-regulated, and it'll happen because it has to happen and it's measurable across there. But the other option is that I leave the decarbonization with the private entity, right, that's responsible for putting the product out. Chances are there'll be a lot more innovation taking place, right? Because they'll instinctively do things that make sense, but it may not be as regulated or provable across there. And that is a decision that I think we're looking at a decade worth of back and forth of how
Yeah.
that's going to be handled.
And of
that
course, that's partly why I think they've, the policymakers have gone for the financial services industry and said, it's financial risk, so you need to get a grip on it, because then as the capital is being allocated, they can ask the questions. So then there's pressure on the corporates, and the corporates have to respond. And so that's another approach. Would you agree?
I would agree. And there's, the question of, ESG reporting versus materiality.
Absolutely.
Right? Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, so you described, obviously with the smart cities, and then obviously you've spoken about the S piece and putting that into systems so that it's more quantitative rather than qualitative. But you spoke to me in the before the interview a little bit about the use of things like DLT and blockchain as these built human capital environments land into the natural capital world. And I think an example in the Amazon, if I'm right. Can you tell us a little bit about how you're applying technologies into that world?
Sure, absolutely. And let me provide some context of why you would even do this, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do it, right? So we believe part of just solving that riddle of quantitative and qualitative components, because it's the triple bottom line, right? People, planet, and profit, and there's a plethora of techniques and solutions and indexes, as we know, they're out there, and there's probably too many, right? Because how do you know where to go across here?
Yeah.
But I think what's key is that, especially when you go back to financial accountability and investment components of ESG, you want to be as much quantitative as possible, even though some things are qualitative. So social, once again, is a bit more qualitative per se, and it's just as important. So why would you want to tie into, say, a blockchain system across there? There's a couple of reasons. Firstly, take it back to make a program meaningful, in order to get to a level where that program can be measurable, that you are using the right metrics, that it can be audited properly. That is what digital transformation agendas have become over the last decade, right? It was kind of a question back then of what is my digital transformation component? And until they really became embedded into technology or ERP systems of record, it was hard to say, are you really digitally transforming? Yes, I'm a digital company. Okay, prove it. Now, sustainability is kind of at this level. Well, from my emissions point of view, okay, I can prove this, but for the other aspects, maybe it's not much. So if you can start tying into your sustainability data and collection, if you can verify it, if you know what to collect, if you understand the frameworks, that's not enough. You have to be able to also get it into these systems so that when you're delivering on this, it's just as accountable. And as we know in Europe, and it should be in the US pretty soon also, your board members will be directly impacted, right? And your investment strategies with ESG coming across there. So it's all very, very important. So now going back to this idea of blockchain and the Amazon and other programs. If companies, first thing that they should do, I think, to address their decarbonization of their ESG components is saying, first of all, I should be producing as least carbon as possible. And I want to do this as a first strategy versus, say, buying or trading. And the reason is this, is that companies, first thing that they should do is they'll set an internal carbon price. And they'll say, okay, this is how much my carbon is costing me, and therefore I can now set strategies against this. Why it's a challenge is the price I set today is kind of up to what I think as a company or my particular industry, and whether I choose to participate in a group number or my single number, it's all independent. That number is not a stable number, right? We can only assume that over the decade, as there's more government regulation, as there are more forays into sustainability, who knows what that number could be? It could be double, it could be quadruple, it could be more than that across there. So basing your strategy off of an unstable number is is a tricky thing to navigate. And I think only the financial institutions can figure this out. I think most other organizations aren't going to be able to do this. So in order to address and alleviate this, what a lot of companies will do is they'll what they call our CSR programs. So that would be, if I'm producing carbon, which everybody is, what are the acknowledged projects which go against that ledger across there? So what 1 metric ton of carbon costs, whether it's working planting trees, or whether it's creating local climate action committees, or things that involve not regulating is the wrong word, but actually involving local communities in job creation, or doing tech for good to impact society. Well, those go against your credits, and that's good, because that's how you go across here. So many companies have huge amounts of carbon, and they're actually looking at strategies that say, all right, first I've tried to reduce my carbon. I still have a lot of excess carbon, either on their own or working with third-party companies, and we do this a lot with others. What programs could we then put in place that will improve communities, improve the climate in all these areas? That still has to be provable and traceable.
Right.
So if you take a company that says, I want to help with the rainforest because I know that gives me so much against my carbon pricing, that's great. How do you prove it? And as you can imagine, these are very complex areas that go across there. So areas like blockchain, or technologies like blockchain, give some system of record that says proof is there, because we are now all being audited by major organizations and by governments saying, what are you doing? If you're making these claims, if you're actually spending against your carbon price, if you're able to claim this, it has to be provable in a way that's going to be long lasting. So therefore, technologies like blockchain and other types of reporting mechanisms are absolutely vital, or none of it is valid.
Yeah. So it's independent, it's verified, it's material, and because it's locked into the blockchain, you have that immutability, and you can go back and verify, if there's an issue somewhere further down the line, what actually happened, and who owned what, and who did what, etc.
Yeah, I'll give you an example of how we do it for ourselves here. So as mentioned, I do a lot with buildings. So I head up our smart spaces, which is city infrastructure in our own buildings. We have quite an amount of space, 50 million square feet across. And we, the reason I have both of these roles is that buildings themselves are responsible for 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions on the planet. So it is the single thing that every organization has someplace where people work, whether it's a factory or an office building or land that they use. It's a huge impact across there. And buildings and smart spaces really comprise of 3 towers. There's this energy efficiency, which is usually monitored through building systems and IoT devices. The second has to do with user experience comfort levels. And then the third has to do with sustainability components, whether it's water, wasted usage, how those buildings are actually, what footprint that they have across there. So the way that we look at it with our buildings, as I said, we're 25% LEED certified. We've also created energy fields that are solar powered in regions that could take that kind of technology relief. We've also done renewables. We've created robots that actually clean the solar panels that are solar controlled themselves. And now we put AI intelligence that actually allow for weather prediction in order to know what to do when.
Right.
All of that is great, right? But we still have carbon because we all produce carbon. So we've also put into our factors that whenever somebody within my organization travels, before my travel gets approved, and it pretty much is within 15 or 20 seconds, we actually have a calculator that says 2 trees will be planted for every mile in the rainforest. And we have to prove that out, that I travel. So until that has been verified in the system, I can't get my travel approved, right? And so, and we have several programs around the world like that. And many companies are looking at these kinds of solutions. So it is much as until we get to a world of absolute zero carbon, which I don't think will happen, right? With technologies, it just doesn't work that way. Being able to put renewables in, to be able to have power agreements that fortify these CSR programs, such as the Amazon rainforest or other things that we do in India and around the world. that makes it workable. And many clients and partners actually approach us and say, we have 400 million tons of carbon this year, and we would like to take as much of it as possible through reduction technology. We'd like to take some that's left over and put it into these CSR programs, and then others have to be put on the market for trade value in order to fund sustainability. It's just a reality.
Yeah, and there's lots of questions that follow on from that, but I think it's an iterative process, and once you get scale, you get grip on the data, then you can start to actually refine and improve and so forth. Now, one of the final things I wanted to talk to you about, I feel as though we could talk for hours, but is you spoke about people getting involved with Infosys through your gig economy platform. And I thought that was a really interesting way that you can bring some of this to life, and you can allow people watching this to get engaged potentially. So tell us a bit more about that.
Certainly. So gig economy is relatively new, but it certainly was pioneered for, I think, technology coding and other kinds of subtasks. When we looked at those platforms, we were really interested a couple of years ago to saying, how do we bring more talent in order to fulfill services? When we looked at building sustainability services, taking it outwards, we made a commitment that said every proposal that goes outside of Infosys must have sustainability embedded in it, and that's a big task, right? Yeah. We've calculated that Infosys could impact 80 million lives through technology for good, by 2025, based on who we're working with, what they're trying to do, what our partners do, what we can do ourselves here. We're 250,000 individuals, and even if we added all the companies we worked for and clients and partners, we're nowhere near 80 million, right? So how do you not only bring in the scale and scope to take on a task like this for the many different kinds of companies and the many different variations that we would have to say, but how do you impact 80 million lives, right? So there has to be what we call practical sustainability that says doable things that are achievable in a certain amount of time that actually make a difference, but it has to be backed by real science, because you can't design energy fields, you cannot claim you're taking carbon out unless there's real proof of what's going on here. Absolutely. And even if we had 100 of the best data scientists, in our organization, we still have, relationships with like 95 universities, academic universities. We have relationships with the UN and with the WEF. We have relationships with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and organizations such as yourself. However, we need to find a way in order to have individuals who are, say, a doctorate in water science also work hand in hand with someone who knows how to fix a 30-year-old boiler in India in order to make a building compliant at a point. Yeah. We need to have that mixture of understanding infrastructure and work with large financial institutions and experts and economists. And anyway, there's this whole world of people out there that don't work for you. So the ability to give them access into these kinds of projects and programs is huge. And so by putting a gig economy in place, we have simplified the ability to onboard that talent for just given periods of time. They can choose to take an assignment with us. Infosys will carry the liability, create the tool sets, create the protection of IP, and give them access to these projects. In exchange, we get their expertise and their chance to actually work in the manner that they want across there. And what's been really interesting as we've done this, we have found individuals who might be a material scientist. We've found groups of 40 people who just do service design, but they want to do sustainability. One of the biggest intakes that we've actually had has been students who up until 2 years ago were on one set of majors, going for either their master's or doctorate for biology or biodiversity or material science, and now saying, how do I get a career in sustainability and apply this across here? So that has been our biggest influx of individuals who have come join this platform to say, how do I cross over? How do I get access to these projects? How do I work with other experts around the world in a meaningful way? So it's been fascinating.
I think it's absolutely fantastic and a wonderful sort of end to an interview, because it gives people something tangible to latch onto. Corey, I'm sure we'll come back to talk to you again. I want to hear about more examples of how you're applying things, ways that you can help people to deliver on their ambitions, but they just don't know how to execute on it. But for now, Corey, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, Richard. It was a pleasure getting to speak with you.